Hi guys, Josh here from the Dragons in the Hills, bringing you our next instalment in a series of online talks from members of our local community in the Ring of Gullion. And I know I say this every time, but today's session really is going to be very special. So I want to say a huge thank you to Colleen Savage, Anne Ward, and the rest of the Ring of Gullion ambassadors who have facilitated this incredible speaker and talk we're able to bring to you today. You guys are incredible, and your support for the project is endlessly appreciated. The area could not have more wonderful representatives. Now it's time to get excited, as today we're hearing from local historian of recent BBC fame, Seamus Murphy. He has a speciality in landscape interpretation, tracing 7,000 years of human impact on our countryside. So today he's going to be sharing some of his ineffable knowledge and talking to us about the Slieve Gullion famine walls. So a very warm welcome and huge thank you to Seamus. And without further ado, over to you.
Welcome everybody, and thanks to all the people who made this possible, starting with me meeting onward at near Colleen Castle. The famine we broadly know about, and some of the things we think we know are probably suspect. I'll be looking at some of those things as we go through. The first thing I want to mention is that we don't have any photographs of the famine victims in Ireland. Photography was around during the famine, and there are plenty of photographs of people in the big houses, but photographers did not waste precious film plates on the poor and the powerless. What we have is a picture from after the famine of a young man who we pretty well know is a survivor of the famine. He was a labourer on the Duke of Devonshire's estate in Waterford. And that is the only sort of like person who came through the famine that we can actually definitely come through the famine that we can see for definite. For images of the famine, we have to rely on the powerful drawings published in the English press, and particularly in the London Illustrated News. And there's one woman who became the face of the famine and still is, and she's called Bridget O'Donnell, and she was from County Clare. And she's shown here with her two surviving children. And this paper, the London Illustrated News, was also unique in actually interviewing victims. And she told the paper, "My husband had 4 acres and a half of land and 3 acres of bogland. Our yearly rent was £7.4. We were put out last November. He owed some rent. I was at this time laying with the fever. 5 or 6 men came in to tumble my house. I said I would not give them possession. I had the fever and I was within 2 months of my confinement." She was about to give birth. "And they started knocking down the house, and half of it knocked when 2 neighbours carried me out. I was carried into a cabin and laid there for 8 days. When I had the crater, born dead, I lay for 3 weeks after that. The whole of my family got the fever, and one boy, 13 years old, died with hunger while we were lying sick." Now that all happened in 1849, when according to some accounts, the famine was over. The potato blight first appeared in Ireland in mid-August 1845. In the same month, it showed up in the Isle of Wight in Belgium, the Netherlands, and northern Germany. It had been rampant in North America since the spring of 1843, when it's thought the outbreak started in Mexico. And it usually surprises Irish people to learn that the blight affected all of Europe. In fact, it went into Siberia. And that 100,000 people outside of Ireland died of starvation right across Europe. Some people died in England and Scotland. But we lost more than 1 million to hunger and to the diseases that accompany it. And that was because of our dependency on the potato, and that was due to a totally perverted system of land ownership that we had in this country. Whole fields of healthy potatoes turned black overnight. Now that's what a blighted field looks like. In the summer of 45, and the stalks withered. Those who dug the potatoes were met with an awful stench from the rotten acid tubers. And the most productive variety of spud that was used, if not exactly the prettiest. Sorry, I'm just learning how to handle my two PCs here. These are lumpers. This was the type of spud that was commonest across Ireland. Not funny enough, I don't think that much in Cooley or Armagh, but it was the dominant type of potato. And it was particularly acceptable to blight. It gave a great crop. It didn't need a lot of manure, but it was quite a watery spud to say, and it was particularly susceptible to blight. The Lumpers pub in Ravensdale gets its name from the fact that a man called the Lumper McCardle, a potato merchant, operated there during the famine. Most people who planted spuds, you put them in what were known locally as pretty rigs, raised beds, but they're better known as lazy beds. The photo with the two women there, sorry, just going backwards and forward. The photo of the two women was taken at Glens of Anson about 1900. Now, this particular agricultural method goes back to the Stone Age in Ireland. And grassed over beds of potato rigs, lazy bays, can be seen all around Slievegallion, high on the slopes, in places that haven't been ploughed since, and all over Cooley. Then there's one more photograph I have here. This is a lazy bed, but this one's in my garden, because this is the only way I know how to plant spuds, the way my dad showed me how to do it. I still grow spuds in raised beds, just the same as they did at the time of the famine. But by mid-September 1845, blight was in every county in Ireland. And by October, when the main crop should have been lifted, the country was in blind panic. The crop was down by anything from a third to a half. In the following year, 1846, it fell a full 3/4. And it did the same in 1847, the worst year of the famine. But that was as much due to shortage of seed potato as to the blight. By 1848, the crop was back to 2/3 normal with no sign of blight, but the hunger still went on for at least a year or two after that. In London, the government was led by Prime Minister Sir Robert Peel. He's the man who gave us the peelers. And of course, we called him Orange Peel. But he asked the Chief Secretary of the Treasury, the man on the right in the picture there, to examine ways of dealing with widespread hunger. Now, this man came up with the idea of importing large quantities of Indian corn or maize from Canada, about £100,000 worth at the time. So here's a wee quiz question to ask yourself. I'll come back to it at the end. What was he called? This man's name is mentioned in a song. The Indian corn that he brought in was held in depots around the country, and Michael stole some. The maize began arriving in 1846, but the millers didn't know how to grind it, and people didn't know how to cook it. They called it the yellow meal. Of course, badly cooked yellow meal gave half the country diarrhea. So they called it Peel's brimstone. My granny used to say, that shucks and the yellow meal run you. Peel and his chief secretary there that you saw earlier, who was called Sir Charles Trevelyan, they felt it would be against the natural order just to give people food, for not starving people food. They also had a strong belief that God had sent the blight to punish the ungodly papists, and they should not interfere too much with the plan of Providence. So Trevelyan devised schemes of public works such as road building. But South Armagh had a good railroad network, already, built after the Napoleonic Wars. So we got mountain walls instead. There are at least 2 mountain walls on Slievegalia. Sorry, just bear with me here a second. There we are. Yeah. There are at least 2 mountain walls in Slievegalia, but it's hard to be definite as they're not documented or recognised in any way. So how do we know them? They're a bit higher and they're broader and better built than ordinary field ditches. And the best ones, such as the March Wall at Jonesborough, have flat chapstones. And many, if not most of them, run on townland boundaries. The 2 we know about in Slievegalia, they stretch a combined 12 or 13 kilometres. But I reckon that overall in the Ring of Gullion and Cooley, there could be 50 kilometres of these mountain walls. The longest mountain wall of all runs from Carragher and along the Annaverna boundary, and it's at least 7 kilometres, and half of that constitutes the border. You can see it there. It's up near the Turf Road in the Coolies. There's Clonchagora, County Armagh on the left-hand side, and Annaverna, County Louth on the right-hand side, and the wall itself forms the border there. That wall actually starts near the Carragher Hotel. Again, if you're coming along the main road below the Carragher, you'll see there's a wall running up the Eden Tubber, and that is also a famine wall. And then there's the March Wall at the back of Jonesborough. We've got Aiton Napa in the field immediately in the picture, and behind the wall, behind the ditch that you can see in front of you there, that's Dromad, County Louth. So the Dromad area in County Louth was owned by Thomas Fortescue in Ravensdale Park, and he owned the land on both sides of the wall that runs up the Ben Rock in Ravensdale. You can see it from the motorway. He also owned 20,000 other acres across County Louth alone. Sorry, bear with me while I get me. Yes, now here's the wall that you can see from the church in Drummondtee. This is the main one. This is the one we do the walks along. And it divides the townland of Drummondtee on the left from Annahaya on the right. And further over the hill, that wall turns down the mountain again, and there it divides Drummondtee from the Slievegalia townland. There's another famine wall directly above the courtyard that runs almost to the lake. Now, these have no practical or economic purpose for watching livestock or anything like that. But there may have been a vanity purpose, because local landlords had consulted the relief committees that decided how the rate money and grants from London should be spent. So it so happens that one wall divided the estate of John Foxall in Killehy Castle from the estate of Meredith Chembry in Hawthorne Hill, while the other wall divided Chembry's land from the land of Thomas Jones of Jonesborough, who owned pretty much all of Drummondtee townland. The schemes began in the wall building schemes began in the spring of 1846, and within a year there were employing 750,000 people across the country, men, women, and boys aged 10 years or more. Wages varied generally between 8 pennies and 10 pennies in old money a day for men, and 4 pennies for women and boys. The women carried stones to the wall in big canvas aprons. And on the best schemes, and I don't think ours was the worst, everyone got a stone of yellow meal once a fortnight. Now, these walls took a lot of stone. More than could be gathered, say, by walking 500 metres either side of the line of the wall. So stone must have been brought some distance across the face of the mountain from the areas of loose scree. But how was this done? We don't know. Did they pull them? Was it just manpower? The more obvious method would be by pony or mule or the snake. We don't know anything about this. In any event, the stones would have to be broken into manageable size to be lifted up on the wall. And they would probably split using the plug and feathers method, where a line of holes was drilled with an auger, and this expanding wedge was put in, and then 5 or 6 men would hit the pins a blow at the same time and split the rock. But this is guesswork. This would have required some masonry, some mason oversight or some guidance for the workers who were doing it. But a man could be trained to do that in maybe a day or two. Now, the fundamental thing about what was the government doing in the meantime? Well, nothing very much apart from the food. They refused absolutely to stop exports of food. In 1846 alone, Ireland exported 186,000 cattle, 259,000 sheep, 183,000 pigs, and 823,000 gallons of butter. Apart from the maize imports, there were other attempts by the British government to buy food in the international market, but these failed for the very good reason that other governments who either had liked or were afraid of it had banned all food export. France, Germany, all these countries said, no, there's no food leaving our country. But not here. The first starvation deaths were recorded in the autumn of 1846, when any healthy potatoes in the crop were gone. The work schemes collapsed as a new government, a Liberal government, was elected in London under Lord John Russell. They introduced piece rates instead of a daily rate. And they capped all wages at 8 pence a day, but the people on the schemes were too diseased or hungry to earn enough to feed themselves by this time. And they gave up, and from 1847, the autumn, different parts of the country at different times, but certainly by September around Slave-Gullion, the government was not running any more schemes, but was distributing food via soup kitchens. Now, many of these soup kitchens already existed, and they'd been set up by the Quakers mostly. But now the government took them over. I just want to say 2 things about soup kitchens. Firstly, they rarely, if ever, served soup. They made various porridge-style mixtures of oats, rice, maize, and pretty much whatever else they could get. And people called it, at the time, people called it stirabout. Secondly, you can please forget everything you ever heard about taking the soup or proselytizing or spitting on a statue of the Virgin Mary before you got your bowl. With the exception of the infamous Reverend Nangle on Achill Island, there are no reliable contemporary accounts of anything of that nature. And there are plenty of approving accounts of the generosity of Protestant clergymen in general and Quakers in particular. The superism stories appear to have originated in the 1870s. We have a picture then of a line for the yellow nail. There's another story that I just want to mention because it tickles me. One of the things I always heard as a child, heard it from my father, and it was presented as if it was an act of the gospel, is that there was a collection in England for victims of the famine, and Queen Victoria gave £5. And in case anybody thought she was being unfair, she sent £5 to the Battersea dogs home the same day. Now, I don't think this story is true. We do know that Queen Victoria gave £2,000 in one donation, and she gave a number of donations at a time when the Crown wasn't as wealthy as it is now. I rather fancy Mr. John Mitchell may have made that one up. He too is a journalist, of course. But we did get a donation in Ireland of $170 from the Choctaw Indians, who had been relocated into Oklahoma from Florida. There was an Irish priest out there, it seems, a pushy priest, and he collected money off them and sent it back to Ireland. In 1919, De Valera went to visit the Choctaws to thank them in their reservation in Oklahoma. And this is a most unusual picture taken of De Valera. You've probably seen quite a few pictures of De Valera. You didn't see too many like that. But as many of you will doubtless have already spotted, that's not a Choctaw headdress. That's a Chippewa war bonnet. The photo was actually taken on another reservation. But every time any publication in the world talks about the Choctaw Indians, they like to use that photograph. And why wouldn't it? There was a soup kitchen at McGuill's Corner. Sorry, wrong one. McGuill's Corner, that's where the Three Steps pub is. It was initially organised by the Quakers, but then the government took it over in the autumn of 1847. The Jordan family at Tiff Crum had a contract to supply the oats for that. And there were other soup distribution or porridge distribution at Forkhill and Jonesborough. People in need could also go to the workhouse, which was more generally called the poorhouse in this part of the world. But that was a tough choice. Men, women and children were separated, and worst of all, to get in, you had to give up any land tenancy over a quarter of an acre. So that meant you had no road back to independence. Nevertheless, people crowded into the workhouse, poorhouses in Derry and Dundee and Castleblayney and camped outside the gates in big numbers when they were full. It's just important to know that 1/5 of all the deaths that happened during the famine took place in workhouses or the fever hospitals associated with the workhouses. The Newry workhouse later became Daisy Hill Hospital, and it opened in 1841 with capacity for 1,000 inmates, but there were several thousand there during the famine. Stables at the rear were converted into a fever hospital. Well, they called it the hospital, but people called them the fever sheds, where you were left to cure yourself or die. Up behind the hospital at the corner of the Carragher Road and the Camler Road, there's the Pauper's Graveyard, a little memorial in there where the victims who died in the fever wards were buried in mass graves. Over on Eden Tubber Mountain, up behind what was Dan Phillips's house, high on the mountainside there's what people locally call the Fever House. And it was probably an old bully, but it was turned into some sort of isolation house for fever victims during the famine. And there are plenty of stories about that in the area. But in a famine, when your immune system is weak and malnutrition, any passing bug or virus can wipe you out. Most people died. We hear they died from fever. They called it famine fever, but there were two separate fevers. There were typhus and relapsing fever, and both were conveyed by lice, which were rampant when people lost the ability to look after themselves, and there were filthy conditions prevailing in homes, workhouses, and the hospitals. Typhus attacks the blood vessels. The face swells and the skin turns dark, and it gets its Irish name from that flowers do. Relapsing fever organisms enter the human bloodstream through the skin, through scratches or wounds. Within a few hours of infection, there's high fever and vomiting, which lasts for several days. There's a crisis marked by profuse sweating and extreme exhaustion. And 6 or 7 days later, it can all happen again. There was a woman called Kelly McGuinness in Gurneray got the relapsing fever, and she burrowed into the middle of a haystack. And she lay there for a week and sweated it out and survived. Relapsing fever is usually accompanied by jaundice, so it gets its Irish name and flowers point the yellow fever from that. Now, Ireland was notorious for dysentery long before the famine, and it reappeared in 1847 in academic proportions because people were trying to live on wild berries and leaves, and cabbage leaves and raw turnips and seaweed and grass and Indian meal half cooked or raw. Dysentery was ordinary dysentery was fatal for children and painful and exhausting for adults. But the real danger was that it often led to bacillary dysentery, which is transmitted by human or fly excrement and contaminated food. Ulcers, diarrhea, inflammation, passing of blood, gangrene follow infection, and a high percentage of the bacillic dysentery cases were fatal. And I'm just remembering as a child, I remember hearing stories about people being found dead with their mouths and faces green from trying to eat grass and nettles. I know there was trouble in our area of our wells. I don't know too much about it because people don't want to talk about these things, but there were people killed at wells. And the reason was that if you knew your neighbours had dysentery, there is no, or relapsing fever, there is no way you were going to let them put their bucket in your well. If you were a decent person, you would fill their bucket from your bucket. But there were fights at wells and killings at wells. Sometimes, I remember my mother telling me that we had a glan well, and I inquired a bit from my grandfather and others about this. A Tubber glan, a glan well. What was a glan well? A glan well is a well that's fed from a single spring. The normal way is that along a road or a hillside, you'll get 3, 4, 5, 6 wells fed from one spring. And this allowed dysentery or the fever to travel underground from well to well. So that's why there was the Tubber glan. It was so important to people. So we don't know how many people died. We haven't a clue. All we can do is do things like compare the census of 1841 to the census of 1851. And what we can tell from that is that certain townlands, particularly in Drummondtee, there was Eatonap and Fiacalotra, and they lost more than half their population. People may have died while building the walls on Slievegallion, and they certainly did so in fair numbers on schemes elsewhere. Relief schemes were on healthy places with large numbers of diseased people in close physical contact, dysentery sufferers contaminating streams and the ground around the wall. And as I say, one of the reasons the schemes were abandoned was that by mid-1847, there were so few people fit to lift the stone on the schemes. And remember that people had to walk considerable distances to get to the schemes. And then they had to climb a mountain, and then they had to haul stones for 10 hours. And we don't really know much about how they got fed. We think they got fed some sort of porridge on the mountain, but we don't know that either. It's amazing the amount that we don't know about it. But here's a simple question. Where are all the dead? Drummondtee graveyard has a few unmarked graves by the south wall, but they're not mass graves. But we know there are a lot of people in the famine who never made it to the graveyard. All over Ireland, skeleton remains were being found on their hedges and behind ditches for many years. And there are horror stories of corpses being consumed by animals from all, particularly from Cork, from Skibbereen and places like that. And we don't know where the dead people are because as a people we sort of decided to forget a time of absolute horror. And probably a time when maybe we weren't very good to each other. Somewhere in the Public Records Office in Belfast, there's probably a dusty ledger where a civil servant with a nice copperplate hand recorded the names of the people who dragged the stones on Street Colleen. And it'd show how much they got paid and how much yellow meal they carried home to their starving children. And if there is, you know, it'll show names like yours and my names from the townlands around the foot of the mountain. And maybe there'll be a line of black ink through the names of the people who died. I never had the energy to go and look for it, but I hope some other historian will. I don't really consider myself a historian, but I do know that if you want to get the truth, you need to try to remain calm and dispassionate. And I'm not very good at that when it comes to the famine, because I get angry. And we have every right to get angry. Now, as somebody who spent my working life in journalism, I greatly admire the quality of The Economist magazine. And I used to write for one of the publications in the Economist group. But I can never, ever forget what they wrote in one of their first editorials when they started publishing in 1848. They said, the Irish people, rapidly increasing, have been reduced by acts for which they are chiefly to blame, to a sole reliance on the precarious crop of potatoes. In October 1845, as it became obvious that people were going to starve, the Prime Minister Payne said, there's such a tendency to exaggeration and inaccuracy in Irish reports that delay in acting on them is always desirable. Chief Secretary Trevelyan wrote, the real evil with which we have to contend is not the physical evil of the famine, but the moral evil of the selfish, perverse, and turbulent character of the people. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, Sir Charles Wood, said, a want of food and employment is a calamity sent by Providence. Except through a purgatory of misery and starvation, I cannot see how Ireland is to emerge into a state of anything approaching to quiet and prosperity. So there was, among all the authorities, there was a huge belief in providentialism, as it's called, that Providence, you know, sent the famine, and there was, the subtext was always to punish the Irish because they're bad. And the other dogma was one we still hear. Oh, you must not interfere with the operation of the free market. Yes, the free market can kill you. All during the famine, cartoons were published in the English press, showing the Irish freely loading on the backs of the English worker, or suggesting that famine relief might be used for a bit of terrorism. But there's plenty of blame to go around. A great many Irish people did rather nicely, and a very large amount of the land of this country was transferred in the course of the famine from English to Irish landlords. The bailiffs and the crowbar brigades were Irish, as were the constabulary and the great majority of soldiers who accompanied them at evictions. And we, of course, we're the survivors. Did an ancestor of mine shoulder some weaker soul out in the queue for the soup or the yellow meal in the hope of a bigger share? Or did they take a farm which from some Gaian family had been evicted? There were other famines. 1741 was known as Blian an Hour, the year of the slaughter. Proportionately more people died than in the Great Famine. There was no blight involved, just very bad weather and crops. And there was another famine in 1879, our last one, and it was caused by blight. But deaths were few. I'm not even too sure if there were any, because this time the government got its act together, but the government was no longer the major player in providing relief. That was done by subscriptions from it, and it was organised through the Land League, which operated a big food distribution centre in Jonesborough in 1879 through 1881. Michael Davitt came to visit it and he spoke. to a crowd of 1,000 in the field in front of Barney Begley's house at Finnegan's Cross. So every year, when we walked the famine wall in Slievegallion, we stopped for a lunch break near the highest point. And then, with our full stomachs and snug in our fine, expensive hillwalkers' boots and our state-of-the-art rain gear, we searched for fallen stones and put them back on the wall as a small act of commemoration. It takes about 5 minutes, but we spend a few more minutes thinking what it would be like to do it for 10 hours. Shinna will, thank you very much, everybody.
Slievegallion, Slievegallion, she wears a green crown. The moon on the mountain, the sun going down. Her ash and her altar are green mossy boughs, and all round the mountain the white thorn in flower. All around the mountain and all the way home. Slievegallion, Slievegallion, she wears a gold crown. The sun going westward, the summer come down. Our willow and her hazel, our birch and our broom, and all round the mountain the heather in bloom. All around the mountain and all the way home. Slievegallion, Slievegallion, she wears a white crown. The snow in her bosom